Hey everybody, it's Mr. Hasquin, that one social studies teacher, right? I'm here to kind of wrap up the presidents a second time around. The first time I did some of these, they were in pretty bad shape and the audio wasn't great. And I was just learning the show here, and I'm still learning, of course. There's a learning curve for sure. But hey, I want to talk about William Henry Harrison, and we're going to try to unpack his military fame, the fact that he had the shortest presidency, and this irony that turned him into kind of like a historic footnote with this outsized cultural legacy. But anywho, let's get into William Henry Harrison. He was born in 1773 into one of Virginia's most elite families. His father signed the Declaration of Independence. But William Henry Harrison made his name on the western frontier, not in those fancy drawing rooms of the Virginia elite. As an Army officer, he became one of the most famous for his time by defeating Native American leader Tecumseh and his Confederacy at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. That gave him the nickname. Boy, I got ahead of myself there. Gave him the nickname Old Tippecanoe, and he got a reputation as an Indian fighter and kind of this frontier hero, which is a little ironic since he was kind of like a silver spoon kind of guy. But eventually, Harrison goes on to serve as governor of the Indiana Territory, where he oversaw land treaties, westward expansion, and those things usually came at the expense of native peoples. And during the War of 1812, he led U.S. forces to another victory, and this was at the Battle of the Thames, and Tecumseh was ultimately killed there. He retired a war hero, later served in Congress as a U.S. minister to Colombia, and eventually faded away from the national spotlight until 1840. Because by 1840, voters in America were sick and tired of Martin Van Buren, old Martin Van Ruin, and especially the economic mess that was left behind by the Panic of 1837. So Harrison runs as a Whig, and he stages this massive comeback. And it's basically thanks to a brilliant campaign strategy. Even though this guy came from wealth, his team painted him as kind of like a common man who grew up in a log cabin, drinking cider, chopping wood. And Van Buren, who was the actual son of a tavern owner, kind of grew up in a log cabin himself, was labeled as this out-of-touch elite. And they were actually reversed roles. And so slogans like Tippecanoe and Tyler too and Van, he's a used-up man, filled newspapers and songs and banners. And so Harrison wins big. And at 68 years old, he became the oldest elected president at that time. I think it lasted all the way up until Ronald Reagan. But anywho, we end up with a very short presidency here. Harrison wanted to prove that he was strong and up to the job. He was very virile, go patriarchy. And so Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1841, he gives the longest inaugural address in U.S. history, over 8,000 words, in cold, wet weather, without a coat or a hat. He didn't listen to Mom. Now, just a month later, he died, likely from pneumonia, or it could be typhoid. Some feel like he may have already been sick at the inauguration, and his state grew worse after the fact with pneumonia, or there's this thing with typhoid, like the water at the White House may have been, contaminated. So it may have made him sick and die too as well. So we're not really sure of the exact cause. All we know, he's dead. So 31 days after taking office, Harrison's dead, making it the shortest presidency in U.S. history. So, his legacy. Let's sprinkle a little irony in there as well. Harrison's death caused the first real presidential crisis, a presidential succession crisis, I should say. And the Constitution didn't clearly say whether the vice president becomes the president or just becomes the acting president. John Tyler, his vice president, who is in another video that I created, he said, you know what? I'm not going to be the acting president. I'm not going to be the vice president in name and have presidential powers. I'm going to be the president. And so he kicks down that door and everybody's like, yeah, he's the president. And he basically set the precedent for how succession works today. And of course, it's codified now into the Presidential Succession and Disability Act and the 25th Amendment and all that stuff. But anyway, so while Harrison barely served, His presidency forced the government to answer questions about continuity and power. And his grandson, later Benjamin Harrison, would later become the 23rd president of the United States, making them one of the only grandfather-grandson presidential pairs. There you go. We have father and son pairs with John Quincy Adams and John Adams and George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush. But anyway, we're talking grandpa, grandson. Now, William Henry Harrison, that's Tyler. But let's get back to William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison's presidency lasted just a month. And the ripple effects changed how we handle power, campaign strategy, political image, all those things. And so, while it may seem inconsequential, it did have a long-lasting impact. So, please leave a like, comment, share, follow, all those things that I've now been saying for more things that you should know by being alive, because even the shortest presidency can cast a long historical shadow. Thanks for watching.